Awesome.
I don't need it to come up with anything more creative than that, but I'd love for the tedious part to be done. And it is working. All right. Text page. Check our time. Got to give it at least till 12:01. Want to make sure that everyone has a chance to log in once YouTube goes live, although they can always catch up with the soft introduction, the little padding I put at the beginning whenever they are able to. Oh, there's 12:01. I'll call that as being our start time, and let's get down to our study. So, well, now it's officially good afternoon to everyone. We are going to be continuing our study of Torah. Last week, we took a little digression and looked at the section of the book of Esther. But this week, we are back into Torah as normal. We are in Parashat Tzav, and we are looking at the concepts of some of the different korbanot, the sacrifices. Now, there are many different sacrifices, and sometimes there are different variations of sacrifices. And for many people, this whole concept makes their eyes glaze over. They fall asleep, and in one way or another are just not exactly engaged. And I completely appreciate that. I will confess that when I was younger and read through these the first few times, it was hard to keep track of the details and hard to understand why the details mattered. Which is why when we go through these sections, I like to take slices out and dig into them to show you that there is much that we can learn that is not only insightful for how our ancestors viewed their relationship with God, but also that will affect our own relationship with God. The sacrifices were one of the most tangible ways that our people connected to God for centuries. And as such, there is much we can learn from them, even if we are not performing them as they were done in the ancient tabernacle or later temple. With that in mind, let's take a look at chapter 7, verse 11, where we are going to look at the topic of the Todah offering. Now, as we'll see, this is a subcategory of what are called the Shlamim offerings. Also known as a peace offering in many translations, because it comes from the same root as the word shalom. So let's go ahead and get our text underway, and I'll give a little explanation as we go, and then, of course, the bulk of our time will be spent with the commentary. Now, this is the instruction regarding the sacrifice of shalom that is brought near for Adonai. So, just a couple things to point out as we're reading here through Fox's translation. One is that he is rendering the word instruction, already rendering the word Torah instruction, because Torah, while it can mean the 5 books from Bereshit through Deuteronomy, it does have a literal meaning itself, meaning instruction. That's why it's called the Torah. And sometimes it can be a little tricky to figure out whether or not the author means it as being instruction about a topic, like in this case, or instruction meaning the actual Torah, capital T, because of course Hebrew doesn't have capital letters. So here I think Fox is making absolutely the right call, but he is capitalizing it, which is one thing I like about him, to remind us that this is a special form of the word instruction, which could be interpreted differently, but here is definitely talking about the specific instructions of these sacrifices. He is also choosing not to render the word shalom or shlamim in any particular form, like a peace sacrifice, because, well, it's hard to render the word shalom into English. And although it's sometimes a little bit of a dodge, some translators prefer to leave certain words untranslated and try and help us capture that meaning or feeling of a word without reducing it to a singular English one. And of course, his hyphenated brought near is trying to also render this phrase yakriv, which can often be translated just as a sacrifice or to sacrifice, but recognizing that the root of that word is not the same root as the word sacrifice, which is better represented by the word yevach, which is more of the offering. But instead, this is the action of bringing that offering to God. Okay, That's hopefully just a little bit of vocabulary and structure so that the rest of this might make a little more sense. So we're dealing with a shlamim offering, but verse 12 introduces a conditional. We've already talked about We've already talked about shlamim offerings in the book of Leviticus in more general statements, but verse 12 is going to give us a particular. If it is on account of thanksgiving, meaning if the shlamim offering is what's called a todah offering, todah, of course, being one of the first Hebrew words that a person might learn, meaning thank you. If it is a count of thanksgiving that he brings it near, he is to bring near along with the sacrifice of thanksgiving. What does he bring? Matzah cakes mixed with oil, matzah wafers smeared with oil, and flour well stirred into cakes mixed with oil. So there are three types of bread. There are three types of bread that are brought for this. A reminder that matzah is a type of bread, unleavened in the usual English vernacular, but it is a type of bread. There are three types of bread that are being brought along with the todah offerings. This is a very bountiful additional way of bringing this extra nourishment, this extra joy that is coming along with a Thanksgiving offering. Verse 13, along with the cakes of leavened bread, he is to bring near his offering, along with his Thanksgiving sacrifice of shalom. He is to bring near from it one of each kind of near offerings as a contribution for Adonai. It is for the priest who dashes the blood of the shalom offering, his shall it be. Trying to reflect that poetic parallelism in the structure. Something that Fox tries to do, can make it sound a little more confusing, but it is trying to preserve the Hebrew sense. So this additional food is then shared with the priest that is actually performing, actually officiating. Remembering that although Aaron was the high priest at this particular time, there were other priests, his sons, and then later descendants, and you would have to see who it was that was in line to be the next officiant for your offering. 15, as for the flesh of his thanksgiving sacrifice of shalom, at the time of his bringing it near, it is to be eaten. He may not leave any of it until morning. So there are different limits for different types of sacrifices regarding the delay that one can have when actually consuming it. Remembering that the meat would, of course, have normally been something that would be eaten over a long period of time. That is to say, if you slaughtered a sheep, generally you did not sit down and eat the entire sheep within that time period, the day and before the next morning. Generally, you would eat some of it that day once you had removed the blood, and you would eat some of it for a long time afterwards, having preserved it in a variety of different fashion. When it comes to a sacrifice, there are limits because when you are sacrificing something, you have made it kadosh, you have made it holy. There are different levels of holiness for different types of sacrifices. We're not going to get into them today, but the fact that it is holy at all means you can't just throw it into your Tupperware box and leave, because it can only be eaten under the conditions of a sacrifice, meaning that the person eating it has to be ritually pure, and it has to be eaten according to the instructions of the sacrificial service. Well, one of those instructions can expand or contract the window in which it is eaten. And here the window is slightly shorter than some of the others. Some of the others would allow the whole next day. But here we only get until the morning to finish it. Now, you're probably wondering, why does God care? Why do we have this window? Okay, I find the idea that we need to be ritually pure. I can sort of understand that. But as long as I'm ritually pure, why can't I just keep snacking on it for the next week? Well, the primary reason here is not so much that there is a concern over ritual purity status. As I said, some sacrifices do indeed have a slightly longer window. the primary interest here is to encourage the person who is making the sacrifice to invite additional people to participate in the eating of the sacrificial food. If you know that it will expire, that the meat can no longer be eaten past a certain time, then you are incentivized to not just try and eat it yourself, because one person cannot eat a whole sheep or even a cow. I mean, come on, crying out loud. Cannot eat it with even in the most expansive windows. So you are incentivized to invite other members of your family, other members of the community, as the Torah says elsewhere, the Levite, the poor. This is a way of actually encouraging a sharing of that celebration. And in particular, when we are talking about the Todah offering here, the window is shortened, and that means that you are even more incentivized to not keep it to just yourself and your nuclear family. Not that that was a real appropriate term for back then, but your narrow family, your close family, but that you would really open the door wide because there was no way you were getting through it. You might as well have other people share in your Thanksgiving offering. Now, we're going to come back in our commentary about why a person might be offering a Thanksgiving offering. But for the moment, just recognize that this shorter window is actually encouraging a sharing of that celebration. I know that sounds weird. You might be used to the idea that the longer you have to celebrate, the more who can participate. Certainly in a wedding celebration, we often will extend the celebration for a week and do the special Birkat Hamazon blessing each time when we have new guests that are coming for each of those celebrations. But for something like this, the idea was that since there was a limited time in the first place, by having it be even shorter, you would really, really be driven to expand how many people were being drawn in to your celebration. Now, verse 16, let's just do a little bit more. Now, if a vow offering or a free will offering is sacrificed near offering, at the time of his bringing near his sacrifice, it is to be eaten. On the morrow, what is left of it may be eaten. And what is left of the flesh of the sacrifice on the third day, in fire it is to be burned. To provide that contrast that I was just describing for these other offerings, here called a vow offering for neder, or a free will offering, a nedava, those ones have a longer period in which they can be eaten, meaning the day they are offered all the way through the night and all the way through the next day, and then on the third day, any remainder is destroyed. And likewise, at any point when you reach that end period, any remainder gets destroyed. Okay. Any questions on that so far? Okay. Let's just go ahead and see some of the other conditions here regarding the sacrifices, but we'll be jumping into our commentary in just a minute. Now, should there be eaten, yes, eaten, any of the flesh of his sacrifice of shalom on the third day, it is not acceptable for him that brings it near. It will not be reckoned to him. So here we're getting some of the consequences of if you delay in your consumption and you're eating it already past the time when you were limited, then you're not getting credit for this, so to speak. You have now transgressed rather than having brought something that was favorable. As it's put it, tainted meat shall it be considered, and the person who eats of it, his iniquity he shall bear. So indeed, at this point, you are actually transgressing rather than celebrating, and there are indeed limits for what we can and can't do with our celebratory meals when they are these official korbanot, when they are an official sacrifice. Now, just as an aside, although this will become even more relevant when we get to our commentary, this does not mean a person can't have an informal Thanksgiving kind of meal. Certainly in the modern American context where we think of capital T Thanksgiving dinner, that is completely unrelated to this. And you could eat leftovers for however long you're willing to eat the leftovers. That is perfectly fine. This is talking just about the official sacrificial Thanksgiving offering, which had very particular details around it in order that we can be able to properly fulfill the commandment that God gave regarding this. Now, you're probably asking yourself, at least I hope you're asking yourself, well, what is the difference between just saying thank you in my own way to God for anything that I feel grateful for, and saying thank you to God through a sacrificial service? Why bind myself to these different rules and principles and limitations, and indeed open myself up to a potential transgression if I make a mistake, when I could just have a statement of thanks, God? Why go through this official form? Well, there are a lot of different reasons. One is, of course, that by going through the official form, one will often feel different. Indeed, will feel more legitimate in their expression of thanks. It's sort of like the difference between telling somebody thanks versus thank you versus thank you very much for, and then enumerating what they have done. Oftentimes, by making our thanks more formal, we are showing ourselves and the object of our gratitude more seriousness in the depth of our appreciation. And while we might think, but an honest thank you should be just as good as a formal thank you, and that is true, being humans, making something a little more formal will often change the psychology of our own emotions, which will make that emotion more powerful for ourselves and will be perceived more powerfully for someone else. Additionally, by having this be a formal event, by having the whole korban system, the sacrificial system for our Thanksgiving, we are inviting others to witness what we are being grateful for. We are inviting others to see us going to God to show our gratitude. We are inviting others to join with us in the eating of that celebratory meat, and that expands the praise that we are giving. Likewise, in modern times, if I were to say thank you to somebody privately for something they had helped me with, that's wonderful and nice. But if I say thank you to them in front of others, in a way that is not embarrassing or otherwise problematic, but just a nice, legitimate thank you to them publicly, well, that will often mean a lot more, both to the person who is hearing it, as well as to the community or group of friends that are being impressed by the degree of gratitude that is being shown to the person that you wish to thank. So having this formal structure is not meant to take away at all. And while it may introduce limitations, those limitations are ones that allow us to achieve more than if they weren't there. And that means we're going to have to come back in our commentary section to ask ourselves, well, if we don't have sacrifices now, we don't have the altar of Jerusalem, does that mean we are lacking this option? And the short answer is going to be no. We absolutely still have a Todah system, but it is well, a little different than than what it once was. So let's go ahead and take a look at that through our commentary and see how that works out in the modern time. By modern time, I mean more than about the last 2,000 years. But that's modern for Judaism. All right, so let's begin with Rashi's commentary on this phrase, if he offers it for Thanksgiving. This is back in verse 12. Let me just go ahead and put that back up there to remind you of some of the key points, that he is talking about the Todah having just mentioned the Shlamim offering. So if there is this Shlamim offering and then it suddenly adds in this Todah as a subset, what's going on here? Well, if he offers it for Thanksgiving, that is to say, if he brings it on account of a matter that requires Thanksgiving Todah. So what does it mean to offer a Thanksgiving Shlamim offering? It means that you are bringing the Shlamim offering because you have experienced an event and a situation that requires Thanksgiving. All right, so we've already introduced the phrase here, which is that there are certain events that require a Thanksgiving, as opposed to, I feel like saying thank you. These are things that are actually obligatory in the eyes of our tradition. What could that be? Well, on account of a miraculous deliverance that was wrought for him, as being, for instance, one of those who have made a sea voyage, or traveled in the wilderness, or had been kept in prison, or if he had been sick and was now healed, all of whom are bound to offer thanksgiving, since it is written with reference to them in Psalm 107, let them offer thanksgiving to the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men. So the rabbis, which Rashi is paraphrasing here, are saying that these Todah offerings were actually in honor of these four events, for having completed a sea voyage, traveled across the wilderness, been released from prison, or healed from a disease. Those four are specifically mentioned in Psalm 107, and we'll look at that mention in more detail just a little bit later. But now, rather than having this be purely open-ended, we are given a list of required incidents, or rather incidents that require a Todah response. Now, if it is on account of one of these things that he vowed these peace offerings, the shlamim, they are peace offerings of acknowledgement. That is to say, they are Todah offerings and require the offering of bread that is mentioned in this section. Remember the three different types, and may not be eaten beyond a period of 1 day and 1 night, as it is here set forth, which we discussed, while other shlamim may be eaten at any time during 2 days and the intervening night, as we saw from the later verses. So Rashi gives us a lovely summary of the rabbinic analysis of this, which is, this is not an open-ended statement of thanks. This is a required offering of thanks for somebody who has experienced these four things. Now, it may seem a little strange to have required thanksgiving. After all, if you're demanding thanks from me, does it really count as thanks? When your parents lean on you and say, now, make sure you write a thank you card to Aunt so-and-so because of the sweater she sent you, and you don't really love the sweater as much as maybe you think you are meant to, does that thank you mean something? Or is it just a forced obligation? I'll do it because I know I'm expected to. Well, yes and no. That wonderful Jewish answer. Of course, we want it to come from the deepest part of ourself to truly experience that gratitude. On the other hand, most of us, if not all of us, need an additional structure, an additional kick to remind us of what to actually be grateful for. Sometimes we experience things in life that should be acknowledged with great gratitude, and yet we will treat it as though it was a commonplace occurrence, or perhaps not ascribe any gratitude as being deserving of God, or as God deserving that gratitude. Likewise, we sometimes need instruction on what are the examples of things that would require gratitude. Does it only have to be, when I was in the worst possible situation, and now that that situation is gone, I'm able to say thank you? Are there mild situations? Do I have to be chased by the armies of Pharaoh before I can offer the thanksgiving of the Song of the Sea? Or can I say thank you for things that are more prosaic, such as just traveling through the wilderness, or even just traveling by sea? Should point out both of those are generally considered dangerous in the ancient world, and were really up until quite recently. So it wasn't that there was no danger, but they certainly were much more commonplace than the miraculous events that we see in other parts of Tanakh. And this is saying that even for those more commonplace things, we need to render an official thanksgiving. All right, let's see what Rashbam has to add to this. If a person had made a vow using the expression Todah, instead of using the expression Shlamim, to describe what he vowed to bring. So Rashbam, as is usual, is being very practical. He's like, what makes the difference between a normal Shlamim offering and the Todah version? Well, what did he say? If he said, I'm making this as a Shlamim offering, a peace offering, then that's what it is. If he said, I'm doing this because I want to say thank you, then that's what it is. That it goes according to his verbal declaration. Now, the most common occasion when people make such a vow is when they have been saved from imminent danger. The sages in Brachot 54, that's the Talmud, described the 4 types of dangers which qualify for the party who has been saved to offer such a thanksgiving offering, a Todah. The total number of chalot which this offering consists of are 40. Here we are told all the details. So he does the math for us to work out all the different loaves that are being brought, the different versions of bread that we described, and you're actually ending up with 40 different loaves that are being brought as part of this. This is a huge quantity. It is a very big statement of Thanksgiving that is being made. Now, again, you'll notice that we're talking about the 4 types of dangers, like we've already mentioned: the sea voyage, the wilderness trip, the prison release, and of course the healing. That may begin to make you think that perhaps these are the only, or are these just the most common? Are these representative, or are these a limitation? Do we give the Todah offering only for those 4? Or are those 4 a benchmark against which we can compare other situations? And if they are of similar gravity, then we would also do the same. Hold on to that thought, because that is going to become a very relevant and contemporary discussion. We'll need to see exactly where that is. Like I said before, we may not have the sacrifice itself, but we do indeed have something that fits in its place, as we will talk about in just a second. But first, let Ibn Ezra have his say. If he offers it for Thanksgiving, again, that conditional statement, its meaning is if he offers it because he wants to give thanks to God for escaping from some trouble. So Ibn Ezra expands the definition again, not only by giving us the statement that it's some trouble as opposed to the specific limitations of the 4, but he also seems to be implying that this truly is a personal decision that one wants to give because of that, as opposed to one being required to give. And that tension is one that is going to be played out more acutely as we continue. All right, so we look to Rosh, one of the great medieval commentators, and in his commentary about brachot, about blessings, he has this to say. Said Rav Yehuda, said Rav, 4 need to give thanks: those who crossed the sea in a ship, traveled through the wilderness, one who was sick and was healed, and one who was freed from captivity. All right, our 4 familiar categories. The Gomel blessing is in place of the Thanksgiving sacrifice. All right, here we get it. The Gomel blessing, and we'll look at the specific text of that blessing in just a minute, is brought as a replacement for the Thanksgiving sacrifice. Now, what is the Gomel blessing? Well, the Gomel blessing is the underlying response that allows us to speak to the emotion that we have for these 4 categories in particular, and perhaps more, as we will discuss. Now, you're probably still scratching your head of why these 4 are being the ones that are mentioned. Well, as Rashi mentioned, this is related to Psalm 107. Now, we don't have time to go through all of 107. It's a little bit of a lengthy psalm, but I have brought some excerpts from that psalm, and you will see that indeed it is these 4 situations that are specifically mentioned. As we see, thus let the redeemed of the Lord say, those he redeemed from adversity. Some lost their way in the wilderness, right? So here is our traveling across the Midbar. Hungry and thirsty, their spirit failed. In their adversity, they cried to the Lord, and he rescued them from their troubles. All right. Category number 1, crossing the wilderness. Category number 2, some lived in deepest darkness, bound in cruel irons because they defied the word of God. In their adversity, they cried to the Lord, and he rescued them from their troubles. He brought them out of deepest darkness, broke their bonds asunder. There's being redeemed from prison. Now, you will note that although we often talk about the redemption of captives as being Jewish captives who have been taken illegitimately by pirates or foreign governments that we wish to see released, that the psalm is actually talking about what you might call legitimate prisoners, that people who indeed have actually done something wrong, that they defied the word of God, as the psalmist writes, that these are criminals in the official sense, not merely captives, hostages, or in any way, shape, or form victims of someone else. These are people who have done something wrong. Nonetheless, when they have cried out to God, when they have changed their way and they are finally released from that prison, having served their time, so to speak, they too should say thanks. They too are in the category of one who has gone through a great adversity and need to express that in some way on the other side. They are akin indeed to those who are ill. Even those, there were fools who suffered for their sinful way. Although Judaism doesn't believe that every illness is brought about by sin, it does recognize that some people are punished in that way. Even those that are ill because of their own deeds, they reached the gates of death. I mean, they became near death. In their adversity, they cried out to the Lord, and he saved them from their troubles. He gave an order and healed them. So again, even if the illness was brought on because of their own misbehavior, God is ready to help and to try to bring healing out of that adversity. And all the more so, of course, for those that are suffering from the normal breakdown of the human body, not through any fault of their own, but simply because it is normal for the human body to break down. And then finally, our fourth category, others go down to the sea in ships. By his word, he raised the storm wind that made the waves surge, mounting up to the heavens, plunging down to the depths, disgorging in their misery. They reeled and staggered like a drunken man, all their skill to no avail. As someone who grew up on boats, I can tell you this is an excellent description of what it feels like to be in terrible rough weather and to disgorge, meaning to release the contents of one's stomach and to stagger about the boat, recognizing that you just need to hope to get through this because there's very little you can do when the ocean is throwing you this way and that. And in their adversity, they cried to the Lord, and he saved them from their troubles. He reduced the storm to a whisper. The waves were stilled. They rejoiced when all was quiet, and he brought them to the port they desired. Again, that's a deliverance from that difficulty. So, what does this mean? Let them exalt him in the congregation of the people, acclaim him in the assembly of the elders. The wise man will take note of these things, and he will consider the steadfast love of the Lord. So all of these different categories, says the psalmist, are representative of the different ways that a human can go through difficulties, can cry out to God, and can experience a redemptive deliverance from whatever that situation is. And having done so, they should then publicly acknowledge it. That's the exalt in the congregation. And they should acclaim God. They should give praise to God in the assembly of the elders. That this is the appropriate response for having gone through such a situation. All right. Any questions at that point? Not seen anybody on YouTube typing. So let's go ahead then and look at how we actually do this in the modern world. Well, in the modern world, we have a blessing known as Gomel, which I described in general terms before. But here is the specific text. Now, the usual way that the Gomel blessing is done is somebody will come on Shabbat or during the weekday service. They will have an aliyah, that is to say, be called up for the blessing for the Torah. And after the Torah reading, they will then recite the Gomel blessing before the next aliyah begins. The official text that we use in the Ashkenazic service today is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Hagomel L'Chayavim Tovot Shigmalani Kol Tov, which translates to be, blessed are you, God, our Lord, or Adonai, our God, ruler of the world, who rewards the undeserving, meaning me, with goodness, and who has rewarded me with goodness. So we are acknowledging that what God did for us was not what we were owed, but that we received an extra blessing, an extra help at this point. And as such, we have to acknowledge that that statement of God's goodness, of God's beneficence to us. Now, since we are doing this in the public forum, there is a public response. Before I read it, you'll notice that there are slash marks at the end of two of these words. This is because Hebrew is a gender-inflected language. So depending upon who read line 1, which is the same if you're a man or a woman, But if it is a man, we would say the words with the suffix for the masculine ending. If it was a woman who was giving thanks, we would say the words with the suffix for the feminine ending. So for a man, we, the congregation, would respond saying Amen to their blessing. And then, oh, excuse me. And then we would continue on saying, Mi shigamalcha kol tov, hu yigamalcha kol tov sela, right? Amen. The one who has already rewarded you with goodness should continue to reward you with goodness, sela. So we are saying, not only are we acknowledging that you have been given this blessing by God of one of those four deliverances, but we hope that you will receive additional as well. That's not just a sort of pleasantry, that's also a statement of, we don't think that you are now no longer deserving of additional beneficence. There's often a subtext in many Jewish teachings that a person might use up all of their merit and thus not be able to count on any additional blessings from God. And this is basically saying, not only do we acknowledge that God helped you, but we believe that God will continue to help you because you are certainly the kind of person that deserves that sort of beneficence. All right, so that's the official blessing. But as I am sure you are all aware, whenever we have a blessing, there are rules to make that blessing work. That is to say, in addition to the text itself, there is often an important setting that is needed for a blessing. Most famously, something like the Barchu or Kedusha require a minyan, or we require the right blessing for the right thing we're eating. And the Gomel blessing is the same. And we're going to look at some selections taken from Shulchan Aruch, the 16th century compilation of Jewish law that tries to discuss the requirements of saying this particular blessing. So, first requirement, it is necessary to do the blessing in front of 10, and 2 of them are sages. That we need a minyan, and of that minyan, different than a normal minyan, we want 2 of them to be knowledgeable, respected scholars. Why? Well, it's as it is written. Let them exalt him in the congregation of the people. That means 10 people, right? That's our general definition of what is a community. A minyan is 10. And acclaim him in the assembly of the elders. Well, that means that we need the elders as well. And the definition of elders that the rabbis settle on, of course, is not just somebody that is a little old, but it is somebody that is knowledgeable, which is often the word for elder is often a synonym for somebody that is respected because of their knowledge, not just because of the amount of gray hair they happen to have. So we now have a double layered requirement. We need 10 people. And of those 10, we need at least 2 to be respected scholars in the community when we do the blessing. All right. But if there isn't a sage, all right, this has to become our immediate question of like, wait a minute, getting a minyan is something that is fairly standard. We do that all the time, ideally 3 times a day in a community that lives within walking distance of each other at least. But we can get 10 people fairly easily. But making sure that 2 of them are sages, that's a little harder. So what happens? Well, if there isn't a sage, it doesn't prevent the blessing. So while that is the ideal, it is not an actual requirement of this particular blessing. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, what do you mean requirement? What happens if I do it wrong? Well, the problem is with doing a blessing wrong is that because a blessing like this mentions both God's name as well as God's sovereignty, God's malchut, represented by the phrase melech haolam, then that's considered to be a formal blessing, and a formal blessing that is done incorrectly, such as the wrong blessing over a piece of food, or doing a kedusha without an actual minyan, that is considered a bracha levatala. That is considered a wasted blessing, a null blessing, a transgressive blessing, and it is actually more forbidden to do the blessing wrong or under the wrong circumstances than it is to not do the blessing in the first place. So we really want to make sure that we are doing this at the right time. And Shulchan Aruch is pointing out that although it is desirable to have those two sages, it is not actually a mandated part. It is preferred, but even if you don't have those two, if you have 10, you can continue to go ahead and do the blessing in any event. Now, he gives us a few more details. The custom is to bless after the reading of the Torah, since there are already 10 for that. It makes things much easier because we've already got 10 people gathered. If one blesses with fewer than 10, one does discharge one's duty. So in Judaism, when we want to talk about completing an action that we are responsible for doing, we say we are yotze, that we have gone out from our obligation, meaning that we have discharged our obligation. We have left the status of being obligated and moved into no longer being obligated. And as Shulchan Aruch is saying, even if there weren't 10, although that may be the ideal based upon our Psalm 107 text, we are still officially doing our blessing. However, here we get into some controversy, what's known as a machloket. There are some who say it doesn't discharge, meaning that actually if you say this blessing and there's only like 3 people around you, you're not actually having done the blessing. Instead, one should come back and bless before 10 without mentioning God's name and sovereignty. All right. So again, as much as I want to talk about the gratitude aspect, it's also a helpful tool for talking about some of the details of how we conceive of doing blessings and how we edit them under different circumstances. So here, for the group of people that say that, no, you absolutely needed 10, and if you only said it with fewer than 10, or if you said it with fewer than 10, then you need to say it again in front of 10. Even they concede that there is some doubt of whether or not you actually need to say it in front of 10. And since there is some doubt, it is better not to mention God's name, the Adonai portion, or God's Malchut, God's sovereignty, the Melech HaOlam section, but just mention the actual point. What that looks like in real terms, and this applies to many, many blessings, is simply saying Baruch HaGomel, right? We skip the next 5 words and go straight into the participle, talking about what it is that God, what role God is performing that is triggering my blessing. So if we are in doubt about the necessity of a blessing, but we still think we probably should be making a blessing, then to avoid making a bracha levatala, a nullified blessing that was done inappropriately, that was a misuse of God's name and mentioning God's sovereignty, we will simply abbreviate the intro in order to avoid that problem. And Ramah, which was the Ashkenazic statement about the Shulchan Aruch, if one blesses in a less optimal way, meaning, and he gives some varieties of different ways that might work, even with name and sovereignty, it is not a null blessing, since the essence is to acknowledge and thank for the good to his fellow and rejoice in it. So the Ashkenazim are a little bit more lenient on this point. They argue that while it is true that following the instructions of the Talmud and based off Psalm 107, that we should have 10, we should have 2 members that are sages, we should have the formal formula of statement for the blessing. If you happen to not do it that way, you either change the formula but still are saying thank you, or you have fewer than 10 and no official sages there, nonetheless, you may still use the formal declaration, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam. Now, why am I allowed to use God's name and mention God's sovereignty in this way? Shouldn't that count as a bracha levatala if I'm doing it in a defective manner, not according to the ideal level that the other rabbis hold? No, says Ramah and the Ashkenazic world, because you are still fulfilling the essence of this particular blessing. And the essence is to acknowledge and thank the good to his fellow, meaning publicly in front of another person. And to rejoice in it. And if you do that, even if you're not doing it in the most a formal, official way, you are still doing it correctly with regards to the essence. And that means go ahead and mention God's name, go ahead and mention God's sovereignty, you're doing fine. As always, you can see that there are some disagreements between the Sephardic and the Ashkenazic opinions on this, and even within those different communities as well. Remarkable statement, as we see on all the pages of the Shulchan Aruch, of the plurality of opinions and our ability to actually get along with each other despite the plurality of opinions, or perhaps because of it. For those that try to reduce us to only one opinion, usually end up alienating everyone. All right. But the Shulchan Aruch continues with some other important details, which hopefully will bring us back to our own modern moments. In Ashkenaz, remember, this is Joseph Caro in Sfarad, in a Sephardic community, talking about the Ashkenazic world. They do not bless when they travel from city to city. So if you're just going from one city in Germany to another city in Germany or Poland or wherever, they don't do a blessing, even though there's, kind of like not a city in between, and you kind of could call that the wilderness. They're not. Why? They only consider it necessary to bless when they travel in the wild places with dangerous animals and bandits. So they consider the areas around the city to be safe enough that it would be inappropriate, that you cannot say that you were delivered from danger, because those areas just aren't considered dangerous enough. And if they are, then of course, but if they're not, then no. And in Sfarad, it is the custom to bless because every journey is presumed to be dangerous. So Sfarad had a different assumption about travel, which was that every time you leave your front door, you are exposing yourself to risk. And as such, anytime you complete such a journey, Gomel is the appropriate blessing to recite. However, if it is less than 3 miles, at least that's the modern estimate for the distance that is being discussed. It's technically the distance that you can walk in 72 minutes, which can vary individually, but it works out to be roughly about 3 miles under most modern estimates. If it is less than 3 miles, one does not bless, that even though in Sfarad they consider every journey to be potentially dangerous, if it's less than 3 miles, then, come on, that's like walking, just a little ways. And that does not require a Gomel blessing on the other side. However, if it is a place with assumed danger, meaning everybody knows that it's in the middle of a war, or the wild beasts are rampant, or the bandits are everywhere, then one blesses even if the journey is less than 3 miles. So the blessing becomes conditional on the perceived danger that a person is experiencing. Now, with that in mind, we get to the more general statement. The forementioned, meaning the 4 categories of traveling in the wilderness, traveling across the sea, released from prison, and healed from illness, those forementioned are not the only ones allowed to bless. Right? So Shulchan Aruch is arguing that although it may seem like these 4 are the 4, instead we should look at these 4 as being categories or representatives of types of experiences that would ask us to give the Thanksgiving blessing of Gomel. Others who experience a miracle are also required to bless. So if you experience a different miracle, which doesn't fall neatly into one of these 4 categories, and you wish to say thank you to God for having experienced that and be delivered from the danger that you were in, then by all means, come and say Gomel, says Shulchan Aruch. However, he does record a different opinion as well. There are some who say, it's the standard introductory phrase in Shulchan Aruch for a different opinion, Yesh Omrim, there are those who say, one should not bless unless in the 4 categories, and it is best to bless without the name and sovereignty, that they are hesitant to imagine that it necessarily fits that category, and as such, they don't want to use the name and sovereignty and don't really feel comfortable making a blessing outside of the 4 official categories that were explained in Psalm 107 and analyzed by the Talmud. However, that is a minority opinion. Certainly in the contemporary world, the vast majority of people who follow Jewish law will say the blessing of Gomel for a much wider range of experiences than just those that are mentioned explicitly. On the other hand, we also will sometimes not say Gomel for experiences that our ancestors probably would consider miraculous. For example, nowadays, if you were to get into a boat and have a cruise, most people would not consider themselves to be entering a period of risk. They would not be expecting a travel like the psalmist described of being thrown up and down in the giant valleys and mountains of the waves. They would expect, I mean, just you get on a boat, you have fun, you come home, that's normal. And that would thus mean that many people now do not believe that from a routine type of journey that one should bench Gomel, which is why if someone goes on a business trip, the average person does not bench Gomel when they return, because that type of travel is now considered so mundane. It's one of the blessings of the modern world where we can travel widely without being at constant risk, but it does also diminish some of the joy that is felt when returning home. However, if one were to experience danger on that trip, have trouble with the airplane, a lot of that going around right now, or to experience terrible weather that made that trip riskier than what you were expecting, then of course it would be appropriate to say Gomel when one returns safe and sound after that trip. And likewise, we'll finish with the topic of healing of illnesses. Every sick person needs to bless, even if the sickness is not dangerous and not deadly. Rather, anytime one takes to bed and then rises again, meaning is better again, should say the blessing, because it is like one who has been taken up to the gallows for judgment. So the Shulchan Aruch from Joseph Caro section is saying, look, illness should always be treated seriously. If you are sick and it forces you to stay in bed, then you should recognize that when you are better, that you dodged a bullet, to use the modern term, that you were fortunate and you should be grateful for the additional lease on life that you have. Now, nowadays, we often treat illnesses as though they are completely mundane. We often treat illnesses as though they are something we don't even need to rest from. People will still go to school or go to work, and they will muscle their way through and sneeze and cough and do all those other horrible things. And they'll do them publicly or they'll do them at their workplace. Joseph Caro's opinion is that that is not exactly the right way to behave. That one, when ill, takes to bed, and when you are better, you get up again. And when you do so, you recognize that illness should not be treated lightly, that it should not be treated as though it were a mundane inconvenience like stubbing a toe, but that every illness always has a potential within it for serious danger, even if it doesn't feel that way, that every illness is opening the door to potential tragedy. And as such, every recovery should be marked with full gratitude and thanksgiving. Nowadays, I see so many people, when they recover from an illness, simply complain about the inconvenience. I can't believe I actually had to miss work because I was sick and now I got to make up, blah, blah, blah. Rather than gratitude of, wow, I can't believe I was flat on back in the bed and now I'm back up again. And you know what? I take my health for granted way too much, and I should be grateful that God enabled my body to heal itself, that gave me the support of my family and friends, that gave me a modern medicine in my life to be able to get me back up the way it has. And I'm going to say thank you with Birkat Gomel. Now, Ramah, the Ashkenazic tradition, is a little bit more lenient on this. And remember, again, they are always concerned about making a blessing that isn't appropriate. And so Ramah says there are those who say one only blesses for a deadly illness, that if it's not actually something that you are at risk of dying from, then even if it knocks you down and puts you in bed, maybe you still don't need to say Gomel because that's not what was meant. in the same vein as Psalm 107, which did say, bring up to thee the edge of death. Like I said, this is a point of contention between Joseph Caro and the Ramah, between the Sephardic and the Ashkenazic world, and many others within each of those communities. Personally, in our modern world, I feel that too many of us lack a sense of gratitude for things that are more difficult than we often imagine, that we treat them as though they are trivial inconveniences, when if just another few percentage points of change happened, they could have indeed taken our lives. You know, that horrible turbulence experience, that slightly rough landing that we had in our airplane, the difficulty of the storm that our crews had to turn back from. We treat those as inconveniences to be complained about, rather than moments that we should be thankful for that we were able to survive. And we often underestimate the continued vulnerability of our Jewish existence, of our personal lives. And as such, we seem almost inured to that expression of gratitude. Hopefully, as we continue to struggle through the conflict in Israel, as we recognize the horribleness of the attacks that happened on October 7th, which threw into stark relief how even moments of mundane life or happiness can be turned onto their head by the actions of other terrible people. And as we recognize here in Florida with the coming of hurricane season soon, how the weather and other dangers can throw us into a state of vulnerability, I will advise everyone to sharpen their sense of gratitude. Whether you are willing to come in and make a public declaration from the Bima for Gomel, and I'll be happy to help anyone practice the blessing if they need it, or whether you want to just say it around your friends, your family, to simply say, you know, I know that was really inconvenient when you know, we had to cancel the cruise because of the hurricane, or it was really terrible that we all got COVID for 2 weeks. But I also want to say thank you to God that, as inconvenient as it was, we survived it. As inconvenient as it was, we're still here to be able to say thank you. And if we can hopefully sharpen that sense of gratitude, it will make us appreciate the daily blessings that are miraculous, and which our ancestors would see as miraculous, but which we too often just treat as being obvious, mundane, and almost expected, and thus only complain about their absence rather than marvel at their presence. So take some stock, look around you, see what it is that you should be grateful for, and say thank you. Any questions before we wrap up for today? We got some notes in YouTube. Okay, so I think I might have answered that question in our discussion up on YouTube. But the person was asking regarding the idea of, even if the sickness is not dangerous and deadly, why would that be a reason not to do a blessing? And as I mentioned, the issue is that one does not want to mention God's name and sovereignty if it is not the appropriate time to do so in that blessing. And so that is where that tension comes in, that there are some who put a higher threshold on the necessity of the blessing and thus the use of God's name and sovereignty. And for those, like the Ramah, the illness has to be actually deadly before one does that. Joseph Caro, in the Sephardic version of the Shulchan Aruch, says, nope, any sickness that knocks you over, that is one that should be considered as worthy of saying Gomel when you're back on your feet. So hopefully that clarifies that. It's the tension of when do we, how much do we worry about saying a bracha levatala, a wasted blessing, if the conditions were not right. Like I said, in the modern world, too often we don't say thank you for anything. So personally, I encourage people to err on the side of saying caution, saying thank you, saying the Gomel blessing more often rather than less. All right. Well, with that, hopefully that cleared up that point. Yeah, good. Let's go ahead and call it a day. Those of you in person, I'd love to see you tonight at my We Need to Talk discussion. And if you can't make it there in person, sorry, some conversations only work. We're in the same room, but make sure that you find time to talk with other people about things that you might disagree on. There are plenty in the world, as we just saw in our discussion here. Yesh Omrim, there are those who say, and it's okay that we have different opinions, and it's okay to share them with each other, and indeed even quote each other as being an acceptable alternative within the wide range of Jewish opinion. Take care and be well.